My son stole my dead husband's mansion to pay for his girlfriend's Brazilian butt lift, and when the estate company called me 3 weeks later, what they found inside that house made me realize I never knew my husband at all. But before I tell you about the envelope hidden behind the family portrait, the one that changed everything, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. Are you listening while folding laundry in Ohio? Stuck in traffic in California? I want to know, because what I'm about to tell you could happen to anyone, anywhere, and maybe it already has. You see, grief makes you stupid. It makes you trust people you shouldn't trust, sign papers you shouldn't sign, and believe promises that were never meant to be kept. My name is Dorothy, I'm 71 years old, and 6 months ago I thought I knew exactly who I was. The widow of a successful businessman, the mother of 3 grown children, and the owner of a lakeside mansion worth more money than I'd ever need. Today I know better. Today I know that sometimes the people you love the most are the ones planning to destroy you while you're still crying at the funeral. And if you've ever trusted someone completely, if you've ever believed that family means something, then you need to hear this story, because what happened to me is happening to someone else right now, and it could be you. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that the truth, no matter how ugly, is always better than a beautiful lie. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why I spent 3 months planning the most devastating revenge of my life, and why I don't regret a single moment of it. Richard died on a Tuesday. A massive heart attack at 68, right there in his office overlooking Lake Geneva. 1 minute he was reviewing contracts for another hotel acquisition, the next minute his secretary was calling 911 while he lay unconscious on his Persian rug, surrounded by papers worth millions of dollars and a half-eaten turkey sandwich. I remember thinking, even through the shock and the tears, how typical it was of Richard to die at work. 43 years of marriage, and I could probably count on 2 hands the number of times he came home before 8 o'clock. He built us an empire, hotels, restaurants, commercial real estate across 3 states, but he never learned how to just sit still and enjoy what he'd created. The mansion was his masterpiece, though. 22 rooms on 8 acres of pristine Wisconsin lakefront, built from limestone quarried in Indiana and timber harvested from our own property. Richard designed every room himself, insisted on importing the marble from Italy and the chandeliers from Prague. It wasn't just a house, it was his declaration to the world that a boy from Milwaukee who started with nothing could build something magnificent. Standing in our grand foyer 3 days after the funeral, surrounded by casserole dishes and sympathy cards, I felt like I was drowning in that magnificence. The ceilings were too high, the rooms too empty, the silence too complete. My 3 children had come home for the service, of course. Patricia flew in from Seattle with her husband and teenage twins. Michael drove up from Chicago with his wife and their colicky baby. And then there was James. James, my youngest at 34, had been living in the mansion's guest house for the past 2 years, supposedly getting back on his feet after his 3rd failed business venture. Richard had always been too soft with James, always ready with another loan, another chance, another excuse for why his youngest son couldn't seem to hold a job or maintain a relationship or take responsibility for anything in his life. The reading of the will happened on Thursday, exactly 1 week after Richard's death. I remember sitting in the leather chair in Richard's study, I still couldn't bring myself to call it my study, while the attorney, David Brennan, spread documents across the mahogany desk that Richard had polished every Sunday with his own hands. Dorothy, as expected, Richard left everything to you, David said, his voice gentle but professional. The house, the businesses, the investment accounts, the life insurance. There are some specific bequests to the children, $50,000 each, but the bulk of the estate passes to you directly. I nodded, though the numbers felt abstract, meaningless. What did it matter that Richard had left me $12 million when I would have given every penny to have him back for just one more Sunday morning, reading the paper together in our sunroom? Patricia seemed satisfied with the arrangement. She and her husband both worked in tech, made good money, owned a beautiful home in Bellevue. Michael was grateful but not surprised. He'd built his own successful law practice and hadn't asked Richard for money in over a decade. But James had that look. That tight, calculating expression I'd seen so many times before, usually right before he asked Richard for another loan. He sat in the corner of the study, fidgeting with his phone, barely listening as David explained the details of the estate. "Mom, can we talk privately for a minute?" James asked as soon as David finished. Patricia and Michael exchanged glances. They knew that tone, too, but they gathered their things and left us alone in Richard's study. "This is a lot of responsibility," James said once we were alone, settling into the chair across from Richard's desk. managing all of Dad's properties, dealing with the business partners, handling the investments. Are you sure you want to take all this on at your age? At my age. I was 71, not 91. My mind was sharp, my health was good, and I'd been married to Richard long enough to understand every aspect of his business empire. But James had this way of making me feel fragile, uncertain, like I needed his protection and guidance. I think I can manage, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I felt a flicker of doubt. The truth was, the mansion felt overwhelming now. 22 rooms to maintain, 8 acres to care for, property taxes that cost more than most people's entire salaries. Maybe James was right. Maybe I was being foolish to think I could handle all of this alone. Look, I'm not trying to pressure you, James continued, leaning forward with that earnest expression that had gotten him out of trouble since he was 5 years old. But I've been thinking about this a lot since Dad died. What if something happens to you? What if you get sick, or have an accident? All of this would just go into probate, get tied up in legal battles for years. He pulled out his phone and showed me a real estate listing. I've been doing some research. Houses like this one, in this location, they're selling for incredible money right now. The market is insane. We're talking about potentially $15, maybe $18 million. Think about what you could do with that kind of cash. You could buy a nice condo in town, something manageable, and still have more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. I stared at the listing on his phone, a lakefront mansion in Lake Geneva, sold 6 months ago for $16.8 million. It was smaller than ours, not nearly as well appointed, but the number made my head spin. Just think about it, James said, pocketing his phone. I'm not saying you have to decide today, but Dad would want you to be smart about this. He'd want you to be secure and comfortable, not struggling to maintain some massive house that you don't even need anymore. That night, alone in the master bedroom that suddenly felt as vast as an airplane hangar, I found myself considering James's words. The house was too big for one person. The upkeep was expensive and complicated. And he was right about the security issue. What would happen to all of this if something happened to me? But every time I walked through the rooms Richard had designed, every time I touched the banister he'd chosen or looked out the windows at the lake view he'd fallen in love with, I felt him still there with me. This wasn't just real estate. This was our life together, preserved in limestone and marble and hand-carved moldings. I made my decision that night, lying in our bed, looking at the lake through the windows Richard had positioned perfectly to catch the sunrise. I would keep the mansion. I would figure out how to maintain it, how to manage the properties, how to honor the empire Richard had built for us. But as I drifted off to sleep, I had no idea that James had already made his decision, too. And unlike mine, his decision didn't involve asking for my permission. The next 3 weeks passed in a haze of paperwork and meetings. David Brennan walked me through every aspect of Richard's business empire. The hotel properties in Wisconsin and Illinois, the restaurant franchises, the commercial real estate investments that generated steady monthly income. It was more complex than I'd realized, but not impossibly so. Richard had always been methodical, organized. Everything was documented, every process was clear. James appointed himself my unofficial assistant during this time, showing up at the house every morning with coffee and bagels, sitting beside me during meetings with accountants and property managers, taking notes on his laptop while I tried to absorb 43 years of accumulated business knowledge in a matter of weeks. "You're doing great, Mom," he would say after each meeting. "But remember, you don't have to carry all of this alone. I'm here to help with whatever you need." I should have been suspicious of his sudden devotion to my financial well-being. James had never shown much interest in Richard's businesses before. He'd always been more focused on his own ventures, the food truck that failed after 8 months, the app development company that never developed any apps, the cryptocurrency investment scheme that lost most of his college fund. But grief makes you grateful for any kindness, any support, any sign that you're not completely alone in the world. When your partner of 4 decades dies suddenly, when you wake up every morning to silence where there used to be conversation, when you eat dinner at a table set for 1 instead of 2, you become vulnerable in ways you never expected. 3 weeks after the funeral, James arrived at the house with a folder full of documents and that familiar earnest expression. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, settling into the chair across from me in the living room. "I know you want to keep the house, and I understand why. But I found something that might make you reconsider." He opened the folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "These are estimates from 3 different real estate agents. Professional appraisals, market analyses, The whole thing. Mom, this house is worth $21 million. $21 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $21 million. Richard had built something even more valuable than I'd realized. But here's the thing, James continued, spreading more papers across the coffee table. The carrying costs on this place are astronomical. Property taxes, insurance, maintenance, utilities, landscaping, snow removal. You're looking at over $40,000 a month just to keep the lights on. That's nearly $500,000 a year, Mom. Even with Dad's income from the other properties, that's not sustainable long-term. He was right, of course. I'd been looking at the monthly statements, trying to understand the true cost of maintaining the mansion, and the numbers were staggering. Richard had made it look easy because money was never an object for him. But now, trying to manage everything myself, the financial reality was intimidating. I'm not trying to pressure you, James said, though everything about his tone and his posture suggested otherwise. But I think we need to be realistic about your situation. You're 71 years old. You shouldn't have to worry about whether you can afford to keep Dad's house. You should be enjoying your retirement, traveling, doing the things you and Dad never had time for. He pulled out another document, this one printed on official letterhead. I took the liberty of getting some preliminary paperwork together, just in case you decided you wanted to explore your options. This is a listing agreement with Luxury Properties International. They specialize in high-end estates like this one. And this, he said, producing another document, is a power of attorney form that would allow me to handle the sale process for you. You wouldn't have to deal with any of the stress or complexity. I'd manage everything, and you'd just sign the final papers and walk away with a check for $21 million. Power of attorney. The phrase made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. James, I don't think I'm ready to make a decision like this. It's only been 3 weeks since your father died. Maybe I should wait a few months, give myself time to adjust before I make any major changes. Mom, I understand how you feel, James said, reaching across the table to take my hand. But the real estate market is insane right now. These prices won't last forever. If we wait 6 months, a year, who knows what this place will be worth? We could be talking about losing millions of dollars. He squeezed my hand gently, the way Richard used to when he was trying to comfort me. And honestly, I'm worried about you staying here alone. This house is isolated, it's enormous, there are so many things that could go wrong. What if you fell down the stairs? What if there was a break-in? What if you had a medical emergency and couldn't get to a phone? Each scenario he described felt plausible, terrifying. I was 71 years old. I was living alone in a 22-room house on 8 acres of property, 15 minutes from the nearest neighbor. Maybe I was being foolish and sentimental to think I could manage this on my own. I'll tell you what, James said, sensing my uncertainty. Why don't you just sign the power of attorney form? That doesn't commit you to anything. It just gives me the legal authority to handle the paperwork if you decide you want to sell. Think of it as an insurance policy. If you change your mind next month, or next year, I'll be ready to act quickly to protect your interests. It sounded reasonable when he explained it that way. A precaution, not a commitment. Insurance, not a binding decision. I signed the power of attorney on a Thursday afternoon in early October, sitting at Richard's desk in the study, using the Mont Blanc pen he'd given me for our 20th wedding anniversary. James witnessed my signature, then folded the document carefully and placed it in his briefcase. You're making the right choice, Mom, he said, kissing my cheek. Dad would be proud of how you're handling all of this. That night, I called Patricia in Seattle to tell her about the power of attorney. I expected her to be supportive, maybe even relieved that James was willing to help with such a complex process. Instead, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Mom, Patricia said finally, are you sure about this? James has never managed anything successfully in his entire adult life. His track record with money is concerning. He's trying to protect me, I said, though even as I spoke the words, I felt a tiny knot of doubt forming in my stomach. The house is expensive to maintain, and the real estate market is very strong right now. If I do decide to sell, it makes sense to have someone handle the details for me. But Mom, you don't have to decide anything right now. You just buried Dad 3 weeks ago. Maybe you should give yourself more time before you make any major financial decisions. I hung up the phone feeling unsettled, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. James was right about the financial realities. He was right about the market conditions. He was right about my age and my situation. So why did I spend that entire night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I'd just made a terrible mistake? The answer came 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning when I woke up to find James's car already parked in the circular drive. He was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and scrolling through his phone, looking more relaxed and confident than I'd seen him in months. "Morning, Mom," he said without looking up. "I have some great news. The listing went live this morning, and we already have 3 potential buyers scheduled for showings this week." The listing. The words hit me like ice water. What listing? I asked, though part of me already knew. James looked up from his phone, surprised. "The house listing, Mom. I told you I was going to get the process started. Luxury Properties International has been amazing. They think we might even get over asking price if we play this right." "James, I never told you to list the house. The power of attorney was just supposed to be a precaution, in case I decided to sell later." He set down his phone and gave me that patient, condescending smile I was starting to hate. "Mom, we talked about this. You signed the papers. The market is hot right now, and we can't afford to wait. Every day we delay is potentially thousands of dollars lost." "I didn't sign papers to sell the house," I said, my voice rising. "I signed a power of attorney form. That's completely different." "Mom, you're getting confused," James said gently. "Maybe you should sit down. This is a lot of stress, and I know you haven't been sleeping well since Dad died." But I wasn't confused. I knew exactly what I had signed, and it wasn't a listing agreement. I walked to Richard's study and opened the filing cabinet where I kept copies of all important documents. The power of attorney was there, exactly as I remembered it. But underneath it was something else, a listing agreement with Luxury Properties International, dated the same day, bearing what looked like my signature. I stared at that signature for a long time. The handwriting looked like mine, but I had no memory of signing that document. No memory of agreeing to list the house, of setting an asking price of $21 million, of authorizing James to negotiate on my behalf. "James," I called, walking back to the kitchen with the listing agreement in my hand. "Where did this come from?" He glanced at the paper and shrugged. "You signed it the same day you signed the power of attorney, Mom. Don't you remember? We went through all the paperwork together." But I did remember that afternoon, and this document wasn't part of it. I would never have signed a listing agreement without reading it, without understanding what it meant, without making a conscious decision to sell Richard's masterpiece. Standing in my kitchen, holding a document I never remembered signing, looking at my youngest son who was avoiding my eyes, I realized that my grief had made me more than just vulnerable. It had made me a victim. And the person victimizing me was my own child. The showings started the next week. Strangers walking through Richard's house, opening his closets, running their hands along the marble countertops he'd chosen, standing in our bedroom and discussing whether they'd keep the layout or renovate. James handled everything, greeting potential buyers at the door, leading tours through every room, answering questions about square footage and property lines and the age of the electrical system. I stayed in the guest house during the showings. I couldn't bear to watch people evaluate my life like it was just another piece of real estate. From the guest house windows, I could see them walking around the property, pointing at the gardens Richard had planned, discussing the dock where we'd spent summer evenings watching the sunset over the lake. "We have an offer," James announced on Friday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after the listing went live. He was practically vibrating with excitement, pacing around the living room with his phone pressed to his ear. $22 million, Mom. $22 million, cash, 30-day close. $22 million. $1 million over asking price. In any other circumstances, I might have been thrilled. Richard's investment had exceeded even his most optimistic projections. But I wasn't thrilled. I was terrified. "James, I need you to take the house off the market," I said. "I've changed my mind. I'm not ready to sell." He stopped pacing and stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Mom, you can't be serious. This is $22 million. Cash. The buyers don't even want an inspection, they're willing to take the property as is." "I don't care about the money," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew how ridiculous they sounded. $22 million. More money than I could spend in 5 lifetimes. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly," James said, his voice taking on that patient, condescending tone again. This is grief talking, not logic. Dad would want you to be practical about this. He'd want you to take care of yourself, to secure your future. Maybe he was right. Maybe grief was clouding my judgment. But something deeper than logic was telling me that selling the house would be the biggest mistake of my life. This wasn't just Richard's masterpiece, it was his legacy, his gift to me, his way of ensuring I'd always have a piece of him even after he was gone. Take the house off the market, I repeated. I'll pay whatever penalties are necessary, but I'm not selling. James's expression hardened. Mom, you already accepted the offer. I accepted it on your behalf, using the power of attorney you signed. The sale is happening whether you like it or not. The words hit me like a physical slap. You accepted an offer without talking to me first. I have power of attorney, Mom. That means I can make these decisions for you. And this is the right decision, even if you're too emotional to see it right now. I stared at my youngest son, this man I'd given birth to, raised, loved unconditionally for 34 years, and realized I was looking at a stranger. The James the first knew was irresponsible and immature, but he wasn't cruel. He wasn't calculating. He wouldn't steal my husband's legacy while I was still mourning his death. Or maybe he would. Maybe I'd just never seen this side of him before because he'd never had access to anything worth $22 million. I'm calling David Brennan, I said, reaching for my phone. I'm going to have him revoke the power of attorney and cancel this sale. Go ahead and call him, James said with a confidence that made my blood run cold. But the paperwork is already in motion. The buyers have put down $1 million earnest deposit. There are contracts, legal obligations, financial penalties for backing out. Even if you could stop the sale, which you can't, it would cost you more money than you can afford. I called David Brennan that afternoon, but James was right about the legal complications. The sale was scheduled to close in 3 weeks. The buyers had already arranged financing, ordered inspections, begun the process of transferring utilities. Stopping the sale at this point would require proving that James had exceeded his authority or acted against my interests, which would mean months of litigation and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Dorothy, I have to ask, David said gently. Did you understand what you were signing when you gave James power of attorney? Did he explain that this would allow him to make binding financial decisions on your behalf? I tried to remember that Thursday afternoon in Richard's study. I remembered James explaining that the power of attorney was just a precaution, insurance in case I decided to sell later. I remembered him saying it didn't commit me to anything. But maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe grief had made me careless, inattentive to the legal implications of what I was signing. Or maybe James had deliberately misled me. What are my options? I asked David. There was a long pause. At this point, your best option is probably to let the sale proceed and focus on what you want to do with the proceeds. $22 million is a substantial sum, Dorothy. It's enough to ensure your security and comfort for the rest of your life, regardless of where you choose to live. That night, I sat in Richard's study for what I knew might be the last time, surrounded by the books he'd collected, the awards he'd earned, the photographs documenting 43 years of marriage and 3 children and a business empire built from nothing. In 3 weeks, all of this would belong to strangers. The desk where he'd planned his first hotel acquisition, the chair where he'd taught our children to read, the windows that framed his favorite view of the lake, all of it would be gone. I opened Richard's laptop, which I'd barely touched since his death, and started typing an email to Patricia and Michael. I needed them to know what was happening. I needed them to understand that their brother was selling their father's house without my permission, using legal documents I'd signed under false pretenses. But before I could finish the email, I heard voices outside the study window. James was on the porch, talking on his phone, and he sounded happier than I'd heard him in years. Yeah, the closing is in 3 weeks, he was saying. $22 million, cash. Can you believe it? I mean, I always knew the old place was worth serious money, but this is beyond anything I imagined. There was a pause, and then James laughed, a sound that made my stomach turn. Trust me, she'll get over it. Mom's always been sentimental about stupid stuff, but $22 million is $22 million. She'll thank me eventually, when she realizes how much I've saved her in maintenance and taxes and all that other bullshit. Another pause. Actually, I was thinking we should book that trip to Thailand we talked about. First class, 5-star resorts, the whole thing. Hell, with this kind of money, we could stay for 2 months. Maybe get you that surgery you wanted while we're there. You know, the Brazilian butt lift thing. Medical tourism. Baby. Get your ass done in Brazil and then hit the beaches in Thailand. What do you think? My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the laptop. James was planning to use the money from my husband's house to pay for his girlfriend's cosmetic surgery and a luxury vacation to Thailand. The house Richard had designed as his masterpiece, the legacy he'd intended for me, was being converted into breast implants and business-class flights and five-star resort bookings. I closed the laptop and walked upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Richard for 20 years. I lay down on his side of the bed, pressed my face into his pillow, and cried until there were no tears left. But somewhere between the crying and the anger and the crushing weight of betrayal, something else began to grow. Something cold and focused and completely unlike anything I'd ever felt before. If James thought he could steal my husband's legacy while I was too grief-stricken to fight back, he was about to learn how wrong he was. If he thought $22 million made him untouchable, he was about to discover that some things are worth more than money. And if he thought his mother was just a sentimental old woman who would roll over and accept this humiliation, he was about to meet a side of Dorothy Richardson he'd never seen before. The sale might be happening in 3 weeks, but I still had 3 weeks to act. And I was going to use every single day. I spent the next morning in Richard's study, going through every file, every document, every piece of paper he'd kept in his desk and filing cabinets. If James thought he could manipulate me because I was ignorant about our financial situation, I was going to prove him wrong. What I found was both reassuring and devastating. Reassuring because Richard's business empire was even more substantial than I'd realized. The monthly income from the hotel properties and commercial real estate was more than enough to maintain the mansion indefinitely. Devastating because I also found evidence of a side of Richard's life I'd never known existed. The first hint was a credit card statement dated 3 months before Richard's death. American Express black card, with charges I didn't recognize. $5,000 at something called Elite Companions International. $800 at a hotel in Chicago on a day when Richard had told me he was visiting our property in Milwaukee. $1,500 at a jewelry store in Madison, purchasing items that had never appeared in my jewelry box. My hands were shaking as I opened more statements, going back month by month, uncovering a pattern of expenses that told a story I didn't want to believe. Hotels in cities where Richard supposedly had business meetings, but the meeting dates didn't match the hotel charges. Restaurants where he'd spent hundreds of dollars on dinners for 2 when he told me he was eating alone. Purchases from lingerie stores, perfume counters, florists, all for women who weren't me. The most damning evidence was in a folder marked personal that I found locked in the bottom drawer of Richard's desk. Inside were printed emails, dating back over 2 years, between Richard and someone named Amber Sinclair. The first email was flirtatious but relatively innocent. Richard complimenting Amber on her presentation at a hotel industry conference, Amber thanking him for the advice he'd given about her career goals. But the emails quickly became more personal, more intimate, more explicit about the nature of their relationship. "I can't stop thinking about last weekend," Richard had written in an email dated 18 months ago. "Being with you makes me feel young again, like I'm starting my life over instead of just going through the motions." "I love you too," Amber had replied. "I know this situation is complicated, but what we have is real. I don't care about the age difference or the fact that you're married. When we're together, nothing else matters." I read every email in that folder, 43 messages spanning 2 years, documenting an affair that had been much more than just physical. Richard had been emotionally involved with Amber Sinclair, a 28-year-old hotel manager he'd met at a conference in Las Vegas. He'd been supporting her financially, paying for her apartment, her car, her credit cards. He'd been planning to leave me for her. The last email in the folder was dated 1 week before Richard's death. Amber was pressing him to make a decision, to either divorce me and marry her, or end their relationship entirely. She was tired of being a secret, tired of stolen weekends and hidden hotel meetings, tired of waiting for him to choose her over his wife of 43 years. "I need to know where I stand," she'd written. "I'm 28 years old, Richard. I want a family, a real relationship, a future with someone who's actually available. If you can't give me that, then we need to end this now before we both waste any more time." Richard's response, sent the day before he died, was brief but definitive. "Give me 2 more weeks to handle things with Dorothy and get the financial arrangements sorted out. Then I'll file for divorce and we can start our real life together. I love you, and I'm ready to make this official." I sat in Richard's chair, in the study where he'd planned our life together, reading about his plans to abandon our marriage for a woman young enough to be his daughter. The man I'd mourned for 6 weeks, the man I'd thought was the love of my life, had died while planning to divorce me. But there was more. In another folder, I found documents related to something called Sinclair Holdings LLC, a company Richard had established 3 months before his death. He'd transferred 2 of his commercial properties into this LLC, along with nearly $3 million in cash. According to the paperwork, Amber Sinclair was the sole beneficiary of this company. Richard hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been systematically moving assets out of our joint ownership and into a company controlled by his mistress. If he'd lived long enough to file for divorce, I would have discovered that millions of dollars of our marital assets had mysteriously disappeared. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I couldn't even cry. I just sat there, surrounded by evidence of a marriage that had been a lie, a love that had been one-sided, a life that had been built on deception and manipulation. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. James knew about the affair. I found the proof in Richard's email account, which I accessed using the password he'd written down and kept in his desk drawer. There was an email thread between Richard and James from 2 months before Richard's death, discussing the Amber situation and James's offer to help with the transition process. "Dad, I think you're making the right choice," James had written. "Mom's been living in a fantasy world for years, pretending like you two still have some great romance when anyone can see you're just going through the motions. Amber makes you happy in a way Mom never could. You deserve that, especially at this stage of your life. I appreciate your support," Richard had replied. "This isn't easy for me, but I can't keep living a lie. Your mother is a good woman, but we've grown apart over the years. She's become comfortable, predictable. Amber challenges me, excites me, makes me feel alive. I know the age difference looks bad from the outside, but what we have is real. Don't worry about what other people think," James had written back. "And don't worry about Mom, either. She'll be fine financially. The house alone is worth $20 million, plus she'll get half of everything else in the divorce. She might be bitter for a while, but she'll get over it. Hell, she might even thank you eventually for giving her a chance to start fresh." James had encouraged Richard's affair. He'd supported Richard's plan to divorce me. He'd been part of the conspiracy to dismantle our marriage and steal our assets. But Richard had died before he could file for divorce. The Sinclair Holdings LLC had reverted to the estate, which meant it now belonged to me. Amber Sinclair, who had spent 2 years waiting for Richard to leave his wife, had ended up with nothing. And James, who had expected to inherit millions of dollars from his father's new marriage, had also ended up with nothing, except the power of attorney I'd foolishly signed, and the opportunity to force the sale of the one asset that truly mattered to me. I closed Richard's laptop and sat back in his chair, trying to process everything I'd learned. My husband had been planning to leave me for another woman. My son had been supporting that plan, encouraging it, probably hoping to benefit financially from it. The marriage I'd thought was solid and loving had been a sham for at least the last 2 years of Richard's life. But here's what James didn't know. I now had evidence of Richard's affair, evidence of the missing assets, evidence of James's involvement in the conspiracy. I had information that could destroy James's reputation, ruin his relationship with his siblings, and potentially expose him to legal liability for his role in helping Richard hide marital assets. More importantly, I had $3 million and 2 commercial properties that James didn't know about, assets that were now legally mine and completely outside his control. Standing in Richard's study, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I'd believed about my life, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a young woman: pure, focused rage. Not the helpless anger of grief, but the cold fury of someone who has been underestimated and betrayed by the people she trusted most. James thought he was stealing from a confused, sentimental old woman who didn't understand business or finance. Richard had thought he could manipulate our assets and abandon our marriage without consequences. They were both about to learn how wrong they were. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd found in Richard's contacts. It rang twice before a woman answered. Amber Sinclair speaking. "Miss Sinclair, this is Dorothy Richardson, Richard's widow. I think it's time we had a conversation." Amber Sinclair agreed to meet me the next afternoon at a coffee shop in Lake Geneva, 15 minutes from the mansion. I arrived early and chose a corner table where we could talk privately, though I wasn't sure what I was going to say to the woman who had been sleeping with my husband for 2 years. She walked in 5 minutes late, tall, blonde, wearing a tailored business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She was beautiful in that polished, professional way that comes from expensive skincare and regular salon appointments and personal trainers. Looking at her, I could understand why Richard had been attracted. What I couldn't understand was why she'd been attracted to him. "Mrs. Richardson," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for reaching out. I wasn't sure if you knew about our relationship." "I found Richard's emails," I said simply. "All of them." Amber's composure cracked slightly. She sat down across from me, fidgeting with her purse strap, suddenly looking much younger than her 28 years. "I want you to know that I never intended for things to happen the way they did," she said. "When Richard and I first met, he told me his marriage was essentially over, that you two were just staying together out of habit and convenience. He said you hadn't been intimate in years, that you lived completely separate lives." I stared at her across the small table, this woman who had believed Richard's lies about our marriage, and felt something unexpected: pity. "Miss Sinclair, my husband and I made love 3 days before he died," I said quietly. "We had dinner together every night he was in town. We planned a trip to Italy for our 44th wedding anniversary next spring. Richard lied to you about our marriage the same way he lied to me about your relationship." Amber's face went white. "That's not. He wouldn't. He loved me. He was going to leave you and marry me. We had plans." "He was also hiding assets from me," I continued. $3 million and 2 commercial properties, transferred into a company with your name on it. Did you know about that?" "Sinclair Holdings." Amber's voice was barely a whisper. "He said that was just a business arrangement, a way to protect some assets during the divorce proceedings. He said it would all be sorted out once the paperwork was finalized." "The divorce proceedings that were supposed to start 2 weeks after he died?" Amber nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "He said he just needed to handle things properly, make sure you were taken care of financially. He didn't want you to be hurt any more than necessary." I almost laughed at the irony. Richard had been worried about hurting me financially while he was literally stealing millions of dollars from our joint assets. He'd been concerned about my feelings while he was planning to abandon a 43-year marriage for a woman young enough to be his daughter. "Miss Sinclair," I said, leaning forward, "I need you to understand something. Richard's death means that all of those hidden assets now belong to me. Sinclair Holdings, the commercial properties, the $3 million, legally, it's all mine now." Amber stared at me, probably trying to calculate how much money she'd just lost. "What are you going to do?" That was the question I'd been asking myself since I'd discovered the emails. What was I going to do with this information? How was I going to use it? "I'm going to make you an offer," I said. "But first, I need to know something. Did my son James know about your relationship with Richard?" Amber shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "James introduced us, actually. At that conference in Las Vegas 2 years ago. He said his father was lonely, that his marriage was dead, that he deserved to find someone who appreciated him." Of course. James hadn't just known about the affair, he'd facilitated it. He'd played matchmaker between his married father and a woman half his age, probably hoping to position himself as the supportive son who understood Richard's need for happiness. "James has been very supportive of our relationship," Amber continued. "He said Richard deserved to be happy, that the age difference didn't matter, that love was more important than social conventions. And I suppose James also suggested that Richard should start moving assets around, preparing for an expensive divorce." Amber looked confused. "I don't know anything about that. James and I didn't talk about financial things. He just wanted his father to be happy." I studied her face, trying to determine if she was lying. But Amber Sinclair struck me as someone who was good at many things: seducing older men, managing hotel properties, looking beautiful in expensive clothes, but lying wasn't one of them. She seemed genuinely surprised by the information about the hidden assets. "Here's what I think happened," I said. "Richard was planning to divorce me and marry you. James was supporting that plan, probably hoping to inherit more money from a grateful stepmother than he would from parents who knew his true character. But Richard died before any of that could happen, which left you with nothing and James scrambling to find another way to get his hands on family money." "James is selling the mansion," Amber said quietly. "He told me about it last week. $22 million. James is stealing the mansion," I corrected. "Using a power of attorney I signed under false pretenses. The same way his father was stealing our marital assets by hiding them in your company." Amber was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was hard in a way it hadn't been before. "James called me after the funeral," she said. "He said now that Richard was gone, we should stick together, support each other through our grief. He said he understood what I was going through because he'd lost his father and I'd lost, well, the man I loved." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I appreciated his concern, but I needed space to process everything. The truth is, Mrs. Richardson, I was devastated when Richard died. Not just because I lost someone I loved, but because I realized I'd wasted 2 years of my life waiting for something that was never really going to happen." She paused, wiping away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts to maintain composure. "I'm 28 years old. I gave up dating men my own age, turned down job opportunities in other cities, put my entire life on hold for a man who died before he could keep any of the promises he made to me. And now I find out that even if he'd lived, those promises might have been lies anyway." I felt something unexpected stirring in my chest, sympathy for Amber Sinclair. She'd been manipulated by Richard just as thoroughly as I had, just in different ways. He'd lied to both of us, stolen from both of us, made promises to both of us that he'd never intended to keep. "Miss Sinclair, I have a proposition for you," I said. "James thinks he's going to sell my husband's mansion and use the money to pay for luxury vacations and cosmetic surgery for his girlfriend. He thinks I'm too old and too grief-stricken to fight back. He's wrong on both counts." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder containing copies of Richard's emails, the Sinclair Holdings documents, and the evidence of James's involvement in the affair. "I'm going to stop this sale," I continued. "I'm going to expose James for what he really is. And I'm going to make sure that everyone who helped destroy my marriage faces consequences for their actions." Amber opened the folder and started reading, her expression growing more and more shocked as she absorbed the full scope of Richard and James's deception. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally. "I want you to help me destroy James Richardson," I said. "The same way he helped destroy my marriage." For the first time since she'd walked into the coffee shop, Amber Sinclair smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been lied to, manipulated, and discarded, and who was finally being offered a chance for revenge. "Tell me what you need me to do." Over the next week, Amber and I met every day, planning what we privately called Operation James. The more time I spent with her, the more I understood why Richard had been attracted to her. She was intelligent, strategic, and absolutely ruthless when she felt she'd been wronged. In another context, we might have been friends. "The key is the timing," Amber explained during one of our meetings. "We need to hit James when he's most vulnerable, when he thinks he's won everything." We decided to wait until the day before the mansion's closing. James would be expecting to receive $22 million within 24 hours. He'd probably already booked the flights to Thailand, maybe even scheduled his girlfriend's surgery consultation. He'd be relaxed, confident, celebrating his victory over his grief-stricken mother. That's when we would destroy him. The first part of our plan involved the hidden assets. As Richard's legal widow, I had every right to dissolve Sinclair Holdings LLC and reclaim the $3 million and 2 commercial properties. But instead of simply taking the money, I was going to expose James's role in helping Richard hide marital assets. Amber had agreed to provide a detailed statement about James's involvement in the affair, including his encouragement of Richard's plan to divorce me and his knowledge of the asset hiding scheme. She had emails, text messages, and recorded phone conversations that would prove James's complicity in his father's deception. "The beautiful part," Amber said, "is that James thinks I'm his ally in all of this. He's been calling me every few days, checking on how I'm coping with our loss, telling me about his plans for the money from the house sale. He has no idea that I know the truth about Richard's lies." The second part of our plan involved Patricia and Michael. I'd finally told them about the forced sale of the mansion, and their reactions had been everything I'd hoped for and more. "James did what?" Patricia had screamed into the phone from Seattle. "Mom, that house doesn't belong to him. It belongs to you. Dad built that place for you." Michael had been even more furious. As a lawyer, he understood the legal implications of James's actions better than Patricia did. "What James did is elder abuse," he told me. "Using deception to obtain power of attorney, then using that power to make decisions that benefit him instead of you. That's criminal behavior, Mom. We could have him prosecuted." But I didn't want James prosecuted. I wanted something much more satisfying than criminal charges. Patricia and Michael had agreed to fly in for the closing, ostensibly to support me through the difficult but necessary sale of the family home. James had no idea they were coming, and he certainly had no idea they knew the truth about his manipulation. The third part of our plan was the most complex, and it required Amber's particular skills in hotel management and event planning. She was going to organize what she called a little gathering at the mansion on the night before the closing, a farewell party for the house, she told James when she called him. "I thought it might be nice for your mom to have some closure," she'd explained to him over the phone. "A chance to say goodbye properly, with family and a few close friends. Nothing big, just intimate and meaningful." James had loved the idea, probably because it made him look thoughtful and caring. He'd even offered to help with the arrangements. "That's perfect," Amber had told him. "Why don't you invite a few people who were important to your father? Some business associates, maybe some old friends from the neighborhood? I'll handle the catering and decorations." What James didn't know was that Amber's guest list included several people he really didn't want to see. David Brennan, the estate attorney, Detective Sarah Coleman, who specialized in financial crimes against the elderly, Judge Margaret Walsh, who had been Richard's friend for over 30 years and had no patience for people who took advantage of widows, and Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a geriatric psychiatrist who could testify that I was of sound mind and fully capable of making my own financial decisions. "The best part," Amber had said, "is that we're going to let James hang himself. We're not going to accuse him of anything directly. We're just going to present the facts and let everyone else draw their own conclusions." By the time our week of planning was over, I felt more energized and focused than I had since Richard's death. For the first time in 6 weeks, I had a purpose that didn't involve mourning what I'd lost or trying to accept what I couldn't change. I was going to fight back. 2 days before the closing, I received a call that nearly derailed our entire plan. The buyer's attorney wanted to schedule a final walkthrough of the property, and they were requesting access to some of Richard's business records as part of their due diligence process. "It's just routine," James assured me when I called to tell him about the request. "Big money buyers always want to make sure there are no surprises before they close. I'll handle everything." But I wasn't worried about routine due diligence. I was worried about what the buyers might find if they dug too deeply into Richard's recent financial activities. The hidden assets, the affair, the emails discussing divorce, any of that information could complicate or delay the closing, which would ruin our timing for the revenge we'd been planning. I called Amber in a panic. What if they find out about Sinclair Holdings? What if they discover the affair? James will know we're onto him before we have a chance to expose him. "Relax," Amber said. "I've handled dozens of high-end real estate transactions in my career. Buyers' attorneys focus on property-related issues, liens, easements, zoning problems, structural concerns. They don't care about the seller's personal life or marriage problems. And even if they did find something, they wouldn't share that information with James. Attorney-client privilege works both ways." She was right, of course. The walkthrough went smoothly, the buyers were satisfied with the condition of the property, and James remained completely oblivious to what was coming. The night before the closing, I stood in Richard's study one last time, looking at the lake view he'd loved so much, running my fingers across the desk where he'd built his empire and planned his betrayal. Tomorrow, this room would belong to strangers. But tonight, it was still mine. And tonight, I was going to use it to destroy the son who thought he could steal his father's legacy while his mother was too broken to fight back. I opened Richard's laptop and began typing invitations to our little farewell party. Each message was carefully crafted to sound innocent and sentimental while actually serving our larger purpose. To David Brennan, "I wanted to thank you personally for all your help during this difficult time. Please join us tomorrow evening for a small gathering to commemorate Richard's memory and say goodbye to the house he loved so much." To Detective Coleman, "As you know, my husband Richard was very involved in charitable work related to elder care and financial security for seniors. I thought you might like to join us for a small memorial gathering in his honor." To Judge Walsh, "Richard spoke of you so often as one of his dearest friends. It would mean so much to me if you could join us for an intimate farewell to the house where he was so happy." Each invitation was sent from Richard's email account, which I'd continued to monitor since discovering the affair. If anyone questioned how I'd obtained their contact information, I could truthfully say I'd found it among my late husband's papers. By midnight, all the invitations were sent, the catering was arranged, and Amber had confirmed that she'd be arriving early to help with setup. Everything was in place. James had no idea that tomorrow night, in the house he was stealing from me, He was going to face consequences for every lie he'd told, every manipulation he'd orchestrated, and every dollar he'd tried to steal from his grieving mother. I fell asleep that night with a smile on my face, the first genuine smile I'd had since Richard died. The day of the closing dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October morning when the lake looked like a mirror and the autumn leaves seemed to glow with their own internal light. Richard would have loved a morning like this. He would have stood at our bedroom window with his coffee, planning which projects to tackle around the property, which trees to trim, which gardens to prepare for winter. But Richard was gone, and by evening, his house would officially belong to strangers. Or so James thought. I spent the morning in the guest house, staying out of the way while James handled the closing paperwork. Through the windows, I could see him pacing around the main house with his phone pressed to his ear, probably talking to his girlfriend about their upcoming vacation plans or coordinating the transfer of $22 million to his personal account. At 2 o'clock, Amber arrived with the catering truck and began setting up for our farewell party. She'd chosen everything perfectly, elegant but not ostentatious, sophisticated enough to impress our carefully selected guest list but intimate enough to seem like a genuine family gathering. "How are you feeling?" she asked as we arranged flowers in the main hall. "Nervous," I admitted. "What if this doesn't work? What if James finds a way to turn this around on us?" "Dorothy, we have documented proof of everything," Amber reminded me. "The emails, the financial records, the witness statements. James has been operating under the assumption that you're too grief-stricken and too ignorant about business to challenge him. When he realizes how wrong he was, it's going to be devastating." At 4 o'clock, Patricia and Michael arrived from the airport, their faces grim with determination. They'd taken vacation days from work and paid for last-minute flights because they wanted to see James's face when his world collapsed around him. "Where is he?" Patricia asked, setting down her overnight bag. "Still dealing with closing paperwork," I said. "He has no idea you're here." "Good," Michael said, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "The element of surprise will work in our favor." At 5:30, our first guests began to arrive. David Brennan looked confused but pleased to be included in what he assumed was a family farewell. Detective Coleman seemed curious about why she'd been invited to a private party. Judge Walsh brought a bottle of expensive wine and stories about Richard's early days in the hotel business. James arrived at 6 o'clock, looking relaxed and confident after successfully closing on the biggest financial transaction of his life. He was wearing a new suit, probably purchased in anticipation of his upcoming vacation, and he had that satisfied expression of someone whose careful planning had paid off exactly as expected. "Mom, this is wonderful," he said, surveying the elegant gathering in our main hall. "Dad would have loved seeing all these people together in his house." "Yes," I said quietly. "I think he would have found it very enlightening." The party proceeded normally for the first hour. People shared memories of Richard, toasted his business success, complimented the house and the grounds. James played the role of the devoted son perfectly, accepting condolences graciously, talking about how difficult it had been to convince me to sell the house but how necessary it was for my future security. "Mom's been so brave through all of this," he told Judge Walsh. "I know it wasn't easy for her to let go of this place, but $22 million will ensure her comfort for the rest of her life. Dad would have wanted her to be practical about it." Judge Walsh nodded politely, though I noticed her studying James with the sharp attention she usually reserved for defendants in her courtroom. At 7:30, Amber stood up and tapped her wine glass with a fork, calling for everyone's attention. "I wanted to thank Dorothy for including me in this beautiful farewell," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "As many of you know, I worked closely with Richard over the past 2 years. He was not only a brilliant businessman, but also someone who understood the importance of honesty and integrity in all relationships." James smiled and raised his glass, completely oblivious to the trap he was about to walk into. "Richard often talked about how much this house meant to him," Amber continued. "He saw it as his legacy, his gift to Dorothy, his way of ensuring that she would always have security and comfort. He would be heartbroken to know that someone was trying to take that legacy away from her through deception and manipulation." The smile faded from James's face. He glanced around the room, suddenly noticing the serious expressions on everyone's faces, the way Detective Coleman was taking notes, the way Judge Walsh was watching him with undisguised suspicion. "I'm not sure what you're implying," James said carefully. "I'm not implying anything," Amber replied. "I'm stating facts. And the first fact is that your mother never agreed to sell this house." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder of documents. The power of attorney Dorothy signed was obtained under false pretenses. You told her it was just a precautionary measure, but you used it to make binding decisions against her clearly expressed wishes. That's not true, James protested, but his voice was shaky now, uncertain. Mom wanted to sell. She knew she couldn't maintain this place on her own. Actually, James, I never wanted to sell, I said, standing up and facing my youngest son directly. I told you repeatedly that I wanted to keep the house. You ignored my wishes and proceeded with the sale anyway, using legal documents I signed based on your lies. David Brennan was reviewing the papers Amber had given him, his expression growing more troubled with each page. Dorothy, these are serious allegations. If you obtained power of attorney through misrepresentation, and then used it to benefit yourself rather than your mother's interests, that could constitute elder abuse. This is insane, James said, his voice rising. I was protecting Mom. This house costs $40,000 a month to maintain. She's 71 years old. She doesn't need 22 rooms and 8 acres of property. What I need, I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally found her strength, is to make my own decisions about my own property. What I need is a son who protects my interests instead of stealing from me. What I need is honesty instead of manipulation. Detective Coleman stood up and approached James. Mr. Richardson, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your handling of your mother's financial affairs. But I wasn't finished. The power of attorney fraud was just the beginning. There's something else you all should know about James's character, I said, pulling out another folder of documents. My late husband was having an affair for the past 2 years. He was planning to divorce me and marry his mistress. And James knew about it. In fact, he encouraged it. The room went completely silent. James's face went white, then red, then white again. James introduced his father to the other woman, I continued. He supported their relationship. He told his father that I deserved to be abandoned after 43 years of marriage, that I was boring and predictable and standing in the way of Richard's happiness. I turned to face James directly, letting him see the full force of my anger for the first time. You helped your father plan to destroy our marriage, James. You encouraged him to hide assets from me. You supported his decision to leave me for a woman half his age. And when he died before he could complete his betrayal, you decided to finish the job yourself by stealing the one thing he'd left me that truly mattered. James was backing toward the door, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for escape. But there was nowhere to go. Every person in that room was staring at him with disgust, horror, or professional interest in prosecuting his crimes. James, Judge Walsh said, her voice cold as winter, I've known your family for 30 years. Your father was a good man, but clearly he lost his way toward the end of his life. But you? You're something else entirely. Taking advantage of your grieving mother, manipulating legal documents, participating in your father's deception. I've seen a lot of despicable behavior in my courtroom, but this ranks among the worst. I want him arrested, Patricia announced, speaking for the first time since the revelations began. I want him charged with elder abuse, fraud, theft, whatever charges apply. He doesn't deserve to be called our brother. Michael nodded in agreement. James, you're about to face some very serious legal consequences. I'd recommend you hire a criminal defense attorney immediately. But the most devastating blow came from Amber. There's one more thing everyone should know, she said, her voice steady and clear. James called me this morning to tell me about his plans for the money from this house sale. He's booked a 2-month vacation in Thailand, first-class flights, 5-star resorts. And he's planning to use part of the money to pay for his girlfriend's Brazilian butt lift surgery. The sound that came from James's throat was somewhere between a sob and a scream. You're all crazy. This is all lies. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Dad just died, you're grieving, these people are filling your head with paranoid fantasies. James, I said quietly, sit down. Something in my voice made him obey without thinking. I found your father's emails, I continued. All of them. I know about the affair, the hidden assets, your role in encouraging his betrayal. I know about Sinclair Holdings LLC and the $3 million your father tried to steal from our marriage. I know about your conversations with Amber, your support for his plan to divorce me, your excitement about the money you thought you'd inherit from his new wife. I walked over to where he was sitting and looked down at him, this man I'd raised, loved, supported through every failure and disappointment of his adult life. I know everything, James. And now, so does everyone else. The closing papers were scattered across the coffee table, worthless now that the fraud behind the sale had been exposed. Detective Coleman was explaining James's legal situation to him in terms that made his future look very bleak indeed. Patricia and Michael were discussing whether to pursue civil remedies in addition to criminal charges. And I was standing in the house Richard had built for me, the house I would never have to leave, finally understanding what it felt like to fight back and win. The party ended around midnight, long after James had been escorted away by Detective Coleman for formal questioning about elder abuse charges. The catering staff had cleaned up the main hall, leaving only our family and Amber sitting in Richard's study, surrounded by the evidence that had destroyed my youngest son's life in the span of 2 hours. I still can't believe he thought he'd get away with this, Patricia said, shaking her head. Did he really think you were too grief-stricken to notice he was stealing your house? He thought I was weak, I replied. He thought losing Richard had broken me so completely that I'd just accept whatever he decided was best for me. Michael was reviewing the legal documents spread across Richard's desk, his professional training helping him understand the full scope of what James had attempted. Mom, this goes beyond simple theft, he said. James committed multiple felonies here. The forged signature on the listing agreement, the misuse of power of attorney, the conspiracy to defraud, he's looking at serious prison time. Good, Patricia said fiercely. After what he put you through, after what he tried to steal from you, he deserves whatever consequences he faces. But I wasn't thinking about James's legal troubles. I was thinking about the bigger picture, the pattern of betrayal that had been destroying my family for years without my knowledge. There's something I need to tell you both, I said, looking at my 2 remaining children. Your father's affair wasn't just about sex or midlife crisis. He was systematically moving assets out of our joint ownership and into accounts controlled by his mistress. If he'd lived long enough to file for divorce, I would have discovered that millions of dollars of our money had disappeared. Patricia and Michael exchanged glances. They'd been processing the revelation about Richard's affair all evening, trying to reconcile the image of their devoted father with the man who'd been planning to abandon their mother. James knew, I continued. He helped plan it. He encouraged your father to leave me, told him I deserved to be abandoned, supported his decision to hide our assets. Even before Richard died, James was positioning himself to benefit financially from the destruction of our marriage. Jesus, Michael whispered. James wasn't just stealing from you after Dad died. He was part of a conspiracy to steal from you while Dad was still alive. Amber, who had been quietly organizing the evidence we'd presented that evening, looked up from her papers. There's something else you should know about James, she said. After Richard died, he called me several times, supposedly to offer comfort and support. But what he was really doing was trying to figure out what I knew about the hidden assets, whether I might cause problems for his inheritance plans. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her call log. James has been playing a much longer game than any of us realized. He wasn't just opportunistically stealing from your mother after she became vulnerable. He was planning this theft for months, maybe even years. The full scope of James's betrayal was still sinking in. My youngest son, the child I'd worried about most, the one I'd continued supporting well into his 30s because I believed he just needed time to find his way, he'd been planning to rob me blind while I mourned his father's death. What happens now? Patricia asked. I mean, obviously James faces criminal charges. But what about you, Mom? What about the house, the business, all of Dad's properties? The sale is void, Michael explained. Since the listing was based on fraudulent documents, the buyers have no legal claim to the property. Mom keeps the house, keeps all of Richard's assets, and James gets nothing except a criminal record and a prison sentence. Actually, I said, James gets one more thing. He gets to watch me use the money he tried to steal to ensure that what he did to me never happens to another family. Over the next week, while James sat in county jail awaiting his bail hearing, I began implementing the plan I'd been developing since that night in Richard's study when I'd first understood the scope of the betrayal I'd suffered. The first step was dissolving Sinclair Holdings LLC and reclaiming the $3 million Richard had hidden from me. Amber signed all the necessary paperwork without hesitation, formally renouncing any claim to the assets Richard had promised her. I don't want money that was stolen from you, she told me. I may have been sleeping with your husband, but I'm not a thief. The second step was establishing the Richard and Dorothy Richardson Foundation for Elder Protection, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping elderly people avoid financial exploitation by family members, caregivers, and predatory businesses. I funded the foundation with $2 million from the recovered assets, ensuring it would have the resources to make a real difference. Detective Coleman agreed to serve on the foundation's advisory board, bringing her expertise in financial crimes against the elderly. Judge Walsh provided legal guidance on how to structure the organization for maximum effectiveness. David Brennan helped establish partnerships with law enforcement agencies, social services departments, and legal aid organizations. "What you're doing is going to help thousands of people," Detective Coleman told me during one of our planning meetings. Elder financial abuse is one of the fastest-growing crimes in America, and it's often committed by family members who exploit their relatives' trust and vulnerability. The third step was ensuring that James faced the full consequences of his actions. I provided prosecutors with every piece of evidence we'd gathered: the forged listing agreement, the emails proving his knowledge of Richard's affair and asset hiding, the recorded phone conversations where he discussed his plans for the stolen money. James's attorney tried to negotiate a plea bargain, arguing that his client was grief-stricken and confused by his father's death, that he genuinely believed he was acting in my best interests by forcing the sale of an expensive and difficult-to-maintain property. That defense might work if James had consulted with me before listing the house, I told the prosecutor. But he deliberately deceived me, proceeded against my explicit wishes, and planned to use the money for personal luxuries. There's nothing confused or well-intentioned about that behavior. James ultimately pled guilty to elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy charges, receiving a sentence of 5 years in prison. The plea agreement also required him to pay restitution for the legal costs and emotional damages his actions had caused, though since he had no assets to speak of, the restitution was largely symbolic. "I hope he uses his time in prison to think about what he did," Patricia said after the sentencing hearing. "I hope he understands how badly he betrayed not just you, but our entire family." "I hope he finds some peace," I replied, though I wasn't sure I meant it. The truth was, I found it hard to feel anything for James except disappointment and pity. The son I'd raised was gone, replaced by a stranger who was capable of cruelty I never would have imagined. 6 months after that terrible night when everything fell apart, I was sitting in Richard's study, my study now, reviewing applications for grants from the Elder Protection Foundation. We'd already helped prevent 3 cases of financial exploitation, provided legal assistance to dozens of families dealing with similar situations, and established a hotline staffed by trained counselors who could recognize the warning signs of elder abuse. Amber had taken a job managing one of my hotel properties, proving herself to be as competent in legitimate business as she'd been in helping me plan my revenge. We weren't friends exactly, but we had a mutual respect born from surviving the wreckage of Richard's deceptions together. Patricia and Michael visited regularly, both of them dealing with their own complicated grief over losing not just their father but their brother as well. We talked about Richard's betrayal, about James's crimes, about how a family could seem so solid and loving on the surface while hiding such devastating secrets underneath. "Do you think you'll ever forgive them?" Michael asked during one of his visits. I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness was something I'd been struggling with since that night when the truth came out. "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word," I said finally. "I understand that your father was human, that he made mistakes, that he got caught up in something that made him feel young and alive again. I can even understand, to some extent, why he was attracted to Amber. What I can't understand is the lying, the stealing, the willingness to destroy a 43-year marriage for something that was probably never going to last anyway." I paused, looking out at the lake where Richard and I had spent so many peaceful evenings together. As for James, what he did was unforgivable. Not just the theft, but the manipulation, the way he exploited my grief to steal from me. The way he encouraged your father's betrayal, helped plan the destruction of our marriage, then tried to finish the job himself when Richard died. That kind of calculated cruelty doesn't deserve forgiveness. "But you seem peaceful," Patricia observed. "Considering everything you've been through, you seem like you've found some kind of closure." She was right. Despite everything I'd lost, my marriage, my faith in Richard, my relationship with James, I did feel peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. Maybe it was because I'd fought back successfully. Maybe it was because I'd turned my pain into something constructive through the foundation. Or maybe it was simply because I finally knew the truth, no matter how ugly it was. "The truth sets you free," I said. "Even when it's devastating, even when it destroys everything you thought you knew about your life, the truth is still better than living a lie." But the truth, as I was about to learn, was even more complicated than I'd realized. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring, almost exactly 1 year after Richard's death, when I received the phone call that would change everything I thought I understood about my husband's betrayal. "Mrs. Richardson, this is David Chen from Luxury Properties International," the voice said. "I'm calling about the mansion sale that was cancelled last year. We've been cleaning out our files, and we found something that I think you should see." I'd almost forgotten about the real estate company James had used to list the house. After the fraud was exposed and James was arrested, I'd assumed all their paperwork had been turned over to law enforcement as evidence. "What kind of something?" I asked. "It's complicated," David said. "I'd really prefer to show you in person. Are you available this afternoon?" He arrived at 3 o'clock, carrying a manila envelope that looked like it had been sitting in a file cabinet for months. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with the earnest expression of someone who was genuinely concerned about what he'd discovered. "Mrs. Richardson, before I show you this, I need you to understand that we had no idea about any of the legal issues surrounding your property when we initially took the listing," he said. "Your son presented all the proper documentation, power of attorney papers, everything seemed legitimate." "I understand," I said. "What did you find?" David opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a handwritten note, dated 3 days before Richard's death, in my husband's distinctive handwriting. "We found this tucked inside the folder with your original property deed," David explained. "One of our assistants discovered it when she was preparing to return your documents after the sale was cancelled." I took the paper with trembling hands and read Richard's familiar handwriting. Dorothy, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've discovered the truth about Amber and the mistakes I was planning to make. I know you must hate me right now, and I don't blame you. I've been the worst kind of fool, an old man who thought he could recapture his youth by destroying the best thing that ever happened to him. I wrote this note after my doctor told me about my heart condition. He said stress could trigger a massive cardiac event at any time, and I realized I might not have the chance to make things right with you. I was supposed to start taking medication, change my lifestyle, reduce my stress levels. Instead, I kept working 16-hour days and planning to blow up our marriage. I'm not surprised my heart couldn't handle the contradiction. By the time you read this, you'll probably have discovered that I moved some of our assets into Amber's company. I want you to know that I was planning to reverse all of that. The divorce papers I was supposed to file next week. I never intended to submit them. I was going to end things with Amber, dissolve the LLC, bring all the money back where it belonged. I was going to spend whatever time I had left making up for the pain I caused you. But I also know James. I know his character, his weaknesses, his willingness to take advantage of any situation that might benefit him financially. If something happens to me before I can clean up this mess, James will try to exploit your grief to get his hands on our money. He'll probably try to force you to sell the house, claiming it's for your own good. Don't let him. This house is my gift to you, my apology for the betrayal I was planning but never completed. Keep it, enjoy it, live in it for as long as it brings you happiness. And if James tries to pressure you into selling, show him this letter. Show him that I knew exactly what kind of person he was, and I made provisions to protect you from him. I've left a copy of this letter with David Brennan, along with instructions to dissolve the LLC and return all the hidden assets to you immediately upon my death. I've also left specific instructions that James is to receive nothing beyond the $50,000 mentioned in my will. If he contests this decision or tries to manipulate you in any way, he forfeits even that small inheritance. Dorothy, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I've damaged our marriage in ways that can never be fully repaired. But I need you to know that you were the love of my life, not some 20-something hotel manager who made me feel temporarily young. You were my partner, my anchor, my home for 43 years. Leaving you would have been the biggest mistake of my life. I just wish I'd realized that before it was too late. All my love. Richard. P.S. The combination to the safe in our bedroom closet is your birthday. Inside, you'll find the real jewelry I bought for you over the years, not the cheap replacements James has probably already tried to sell. I hid them there because I was afraid Amber might see them and ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I read the letter 3 times before I could absorb what it meant. Richard hadn't died while planning to leave me. He'd died while planning to come back to me. The cardiac event that killed him had happened during the most stressful period of his life, when he was trying to figure out how to end his affair, reverse the financial damage, and rebuild our marriage. "Mrs. Richardson, are you all right?" David asked gently. I wasn't all right. I was devastated all over again, but in a completely different way. For the past year, I'd been grieving not just Richard's death but the death of our marriage, the betrayal of our love, the revelation that our life together had been a lie. Now I was learning that none of that was true. Richard had made a terrible mistake, but he'd been trying to fix it. He'd been planning to choose me over Amber, our marriage over his midlife crisis, our 43 years together over a fantasy that would never have lasted. And he'd been trying to protect me from James. "There's something else," David said, pulling another document from the envelope. "We also found this." It was a legal document, signed by Richard and witnessed by a notary, officially revoking any power of attorney he might have granted to James Richardson and specifically prohibiting James from making any financial or property decisions on behalf of Dorothy Richardson. "Your husband filed this with his attorney 3 days before he died," David explained. "But apparently it never made it into your files. James's power of attorney was invalid from the moment your husband signed this revocation. Which meant that everything James had done, listing the house, accepting the offer, planning to force the sale, had been completely illegal from the beginning. He'd had no legal authority to make any decisions about my property, even with the power of attorney I'd signed after Richard's death." "Why are you just finding this now?" I asked. David looked embarrassed. "Honestly, it was misfiled. Someone put it with the property deed instead of the listing paperwork. We only found it when we were organizing our archive files. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Richardson. If we'd found this last year, it would have saved you a lot of pain and legal trouble." After David left, I sat in Richard's study holding his letter, reading and rereading his words, trying to reconcile this version of my husband with the man I'd thought had betrayed me so completely. The truth was even more complex than I'd imagined. Richard had been having an affair, and he had been planning to leave me, but only temporarily. He'd been caught up in something that made him feel alive and young, but his conscience and his love for me had ultimately won out over his midlife crisis. I walked upstairs to our bedroom and found the safe Richard had mentioned, hidden behind a panel in our walk-in closet that I'd never noticed before. Inside were dozens of pieces of jewelry I'd never seen. Necklaces, bracelets, earrings, rings, all expensive, all beautiful, all purchased for me over the years but hidden away because Richard was afraid Amber might see them and realize how much he still loved his wife. There were also photographs, pictures of us from our early years of marriage, pictures of our children when they were small, pictures from vacations and anniversaries and quiet moments at home. Richard had been building a secret shrine to our life together, a reminder of what he'd be giving up if he followed through with his plan to leave me. At the bottom of the safe was a small velvet box containing a ring I'd never seen before, a stunning diamond surrounded by sapphires, with an inscription inside the band that read, "Dorothy, still my everything after 43 years, Richard." He'd been planning to give me a new wedding ring. He'd been planning to recommit to our marriage, to start over, to prove that his affair had been a mistake he was determined never to repeat. That night, I called Patricia and Michael to tell them about Richard's letter, about the revoked power of attorney, about the safe full of hidden gifts that proved their father had been trying to come back to me when he died. "I don't know how to feel about this," Patricia said. "I mean, I'm glad Dad wasn't really planning to leave you. But he still had the affair. He still hurt you, even if he was planning to make it right. And he still enabled James for years," Michael added. "Maybe he saw through James at the end, but he spent decades making excuses for him, giving him money, setting up the dynamic that made James think he was entitled to steal from you." They were right, of course. Richard's final change of heart didn't erase the pain he'd caused or the betrayal he'd committed. But it did change how I understood his character, his love for me, and the legacy he'd intended to leave. More importantly, it confirmed what I'd suspected all along. James's actions hadn't been motivated by concern for my well-being or confusion about my wishes. He'd known that Richard wanted to protect me from exactly the kind of exploitation James was planning. He'd proceeded anyway, driven by greed and entitlement and a complete disregard for both his parents' wishes. I called the prosecutor handling James's case and provided copies of Richard's letter and the revoked power of attorney. These documents proved that James's crimes were even more serious than anyone had realized. He'd been operating without any legal authority whatsoever, making his theft of the house a clear case of fraud and elder abuse. This is going to significantly impact his sentencing, the prosecutor told me. With this evidence, we can prove that James knew he had no legal right to sell your property. It wasn't just misuse of power of attorney, it was outright theft. James's sentence was extended to 7 years in prison, and the judge ordered him to pay full restitution for the emotional and financial damages his crimes had caused. But more than the legal vindication, Richard's letter gave me something I'd been missing for an entire year: peace with my marriage. I hadn't been living a lie for 43 years. Richard had made a terrible mistake in the final 2 years of his life, but he'd been trying to correct it when he died. Our love had been real, our marriage had been genuine, and the house he'd built for me really was the gift he'd intended it to be. Standing in our bedroom, wearing the ring Richard had planned to give me, looking out at the lake view we'd shared for so many peaceful evenings, I felt him with me in a way I hadn't since the night he died. And for the first time in over a year, that feeling brought me comfort instead of pain. It's been 2 years since that night when I exposed James's theft and learned the truth about Richard's final intentions. 2 years since I discovered that sometimes the people you love most are capable of betraying you in ways you never imagined, and sometimes they're also capable of redemption you never expected. I still live in the mansion Richard built for me. Every morning, I wake up in our bedroom and look out at the lake, and I think about the complexity of love and marriage and family. Some days I think about Richard's affair, about the pain of discovering that the man I trusted completely had been planning to leave me. Other days I think about his letter, about the jewelry hidden in our safe, about the ring that proved he'd been planning to choose our marriage over his midlife crisis. Most days, I think about both versions of Richard, the man who betrayed me and the man who loved me enough to try to make it right, and I understand that they were the same person. People are complicated. Love is complicated. Marriage is complicated. And forgiveness, when it comes, is the most complicated emotion of all. I've forgiven Richard. Not because what he did was acceptable, but because his final actions proved that our love was stronger than his temporary madness. I've forgiven him because holding on to anger was poisoning my ability to remember the good parts of our 43 years together. I haven't forgiven James. I don't think I ever will. There's a difference between making a mistake and systematically exploiting someone's grief for financial gain. There's a difference between temporary weakness and calculated cruelty. James made his choices with full knowledge of what he was doing, and he showed no remorse until he was caught. The Elder Protection Foundation has grown beyond anything I imagined when I started it. We've helped prevent hundreds of cases of financial elder abuse, provided legal assistance to families dealing with exploitation, and trained law enforcement officers to recognize the warning signs of these crimes. Every month, I receive letters from people whose lives were saved by our intervention, people who didn't have to lose their homes or their life savings because someone cared enough to help them fight back. You've turned your pain into something beautiful, Amber told me during one of our quarterly foundation meetings. She's been instrumental in developing our outreach programs, using her business skills to help other families navigate complex financial exploitation cases. We're not friends, exactly, there's too much history between us, too much complicated emotion. But we've found a way to work together that honors both our grief over Richard and our mutual commitment to protecting other families from the kind of betrayal we both experienced. Patricia and Michael visit regularly, and we've slowly rebuilt our family around the truth instead of the lies we'd been living with for so long. We talk about Richard honestly now, about his strengths and his weaknesses, his love for us and his capacity for deception. We talk about James, too, though those conversations are harder. How do you mourn someone who's still alive but has become a stranger? James gets out of prison in 3 years. I don't know if I'll see him when he's released. I don't know if he'll try to contact me, if he'll apologize, if he'll have learned anything from the consequences of his actions. I do know that he'll find the financial world much more difficult to navigate as a convicted felon. The trust funds Richard established for him are long gone, dissolved and donated to the foundation. The family business won't welcome him back. He'll have to build his life from scratch, without the safety net of family money he'd always assumed would be there. Maybe that will be good for him. Maybe facing real consequences for the first time in his life will teach him something about character and responsibility. Or maybe it won't. Some people learn from their mistakes, and others just learn to hide them better. But that's not my responsibility anymore. I spent 34 years trying to protect James from the consequences of his choices, trying to help him find his way, making excuses for his failures and supporting him through his disappointments. I've finally learned the difference between love and enabling, between helping someone and allowing them to hurt you. The house still requires significant maintenance, just as James predicted. The property taxes are still enormous, the utilities still cost more than most people's mortgages, and the 8 acres still need constant care. But I can afford it all, and more importantly, I want to afford it. This house represents everything Richard built for us, everything we shared together, everything he ultimately chose to preserve rather than destroy. Sometimes I walk through the 22 rooms and imagine what it would have been like if Richard had lived, if he'd followed through on his plan to end the affair and recommit to our marriage. Would we have been happy? Would I have been able to trust him again? Would the knowledge of his betrayal have poisoned our remaining years together? I'll never know the answers to those questions. But I do know that love is more resilient than I'd ever imagined, and forgiveness is more powerful than revenge, and sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is to become the person they were trying to be rather than the person they temporarily became. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you've listened while I told you about betrayal and revenge and the complicated mathematics of family love, then you know that the most satisfying revenge isn't always the one that destroys your enemies. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply refusing to let their betrayal destroy you. James tried to steal my husband's legacy while I was too grief-stricken to fight back. Instead, he ended up losing his freedom, his family, and his future, while I discovered strength I didn't know I possessed and found a way to turn my pain into something that helps other people. Richard tried to have an affair and hide assets from me, but his final act was to protect me from the son who would try to exploit my grief. His betrayal led me to discover not just his mistakes, but also the depth of his love and his determination to make things right. And I learned that being 71 doesn't mean being helpless, that grief doesn't have to make you weak, and that sometimes the people who underestimate you give you the greatest gift of all, the chance to prove them wrong. So let me ask you one more time, where are you watching this from? Are you dealing with your own family betrayals? Are you trying to figure out how to balance love and self-protection? Are you wondering if it's ever too late to fight back against people who think they can take advantage of your kindness? If so, I hope my story gives you the courage to stand up for yourself. I hope it reminds you that you're stronger than you think, smarter than people assume, and more resilient than anyone gives you credit for. And I hope it teaches you what I learned in that mansion by the lake. The best revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. The best revenge is refusing to let their betrayal destroy the person you were meant to become. Hit that subscribe button if this story meant something to you. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to fight back. And remember, the truth may hurt, but it's always better than a beautiful lie. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about an old woman's fight for justice. And thank you for understanding that sometimes love and revenge are just different names for the same thing. Refusing to let someone else define your worth.